good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Polarian Software webinar on FMEA analysis and product development. For some of you across the Atlantic, it's later in your afternoon, and thank you for joining, and for some of you, it's early in the morning. And I would encourage you to ask questions via the WebEx Q&A module throughout my presentation. I wish in many ways that we could have an interactive presentation, but I would also let you know that I'll stop from time to time and look at the questions being asked so that if necessary and if possible, we'll segue to answer and address some of those interest points that you have during the presentation. If for some reason you lose audio or video during the webinar, I would encourage you to visit www.polarian.com, where you'll be able to find and replay this webinar and other product demonstrations, as well as take a look at the same demonstration products that I'll be looking at today in our webinar. You can also download a free 30-day trial to Polarian where you can install it in your own environment. First off, I'd like to talk a little bit about what Polarian is. Polarian is a very critical ALM tool that has three major components: Polarian Requirements, Polarian QA, and a superset of all aspects, Polarian ALM. It is designed to be able to provide you the infrastructure necessary to maintain all the requirements and necessary development artifacts for your products and solutions. Polarian is not limited just to software, nor just to hardware. In fact, it adapts to all processes and methods that you might need. You can see here in this diagram that we have customers that vary across defense systems, medical industries, automotive and aerospace, as well as software, manufacturing, and service provisioning. The idea behind Polarian is to provide the capability to bring an integration between all the requirements and test management necessary, the ability to be able to handle changes, to plan the tasks and programs for your ongoing development, and to do it in such a way that you maintain traceability or connection and links between all of these artifacts all of the time. It will no longer be necessary for you to stop prior to a product release in order to build traceability to make sure that your test cases are correctly executed for your particular requirements, but rather that happens instantaneously in Polarian. But our agenda today is focused mainly on a topic called FMEA. Now, to some of you, that might be a very new concept. For some of you, it might be a very familiar concept, but putting it together with application lifecycle management might be new. So I'll address both some high-level concepts of FMEA as well as using FMEA and risk specifically in Polarian. And at the end of our presentation, I will pause and really open up the floor for questions and answers, and we can dive deeper into some aspects of the products based on those questions as necessary. But without anything further, I'll dive right into our topics. So first off, what is FMEA? Well, FMEA analysis asks the questions like, what happens when things fail? What are the causes of these failures? And if they fail, how bad or how much does that failure affect your customer? Now, for some products, the failure might be as simple as I can't get to a website. But for other key products, such as medical devices or aerospace applications, failure can be very serious with respect to loss of human life. How often will this failure occur? And finally, what action should we take to limit the risk of the failure? All of these come together in a concept called FMEA, which stands for Failure Mode and Effects Analysis. FMEA was first authored by the U.S. military in 1949, and later it was adopted by NASA in the 1970s, also by the automotive industry, and is finding wide acceptance in medical applications as well as software applications. For example, the critical nature of a certain failure of a logon could make credit card systems available to outside vulnerability and attack. So what would happen if an attacker penetrated the website of a bank? Those are the type of questions that might be asked of failure mode and effects analysis, just like what would happen if my tire blew out when I was driving on the highway. There are three main types of FMEA structures. The first is system FMEA. Now that happens generally at the beginning during concept and design of products and services. Sometimes these questions of failure mode effects analysis happen before anything is ever actually created. It becomes more of a thought experiment. The second is a design FMEA. After initial concept, when the product design occurs, when we're becoming closer to prototyping and manufacturing, and this includes both software and hardware, the engineers and architects themselves can address specific failure risk once the details of the actual design are brought closer and closer to implementation. And then the final is process FMEA, which looks at the actual procedures associated with the manufacturing process itself, or the integration of a medical device with a computer and the software that governs the operation of that medical device. These are the types of questions that might come up both during system integration and during product testing. So FMEA might occur in all phases of product design and fulfillment. Well, the idea behind FMEA is it becomes actionable. We don't just say what could fail and what it would affect and how, but what can we do about that? We will talk about something called an FMEA risk priority number, which is a weighted score that tells me the seriousness or the total capacity of that particular risk to affect my customers. And based on that weighted risk score, we can take actions to either eliminate or at least avoid and recognize that risk. What can we do now? What have we done to mitigate these risks? All become very important to the FMEA process. Well, let's talk a little bit about that analysis and scoring. So it's not merely to identify that a risk can happen, that a failure could occur, but rather it starts off with something called a severity. And we'll link this severity score with the overall description or cause of the failure. So what is that severity? Are we losing revenue? Are we losing brand equity? Do we have the potential for loss of life? That is scored on a rotating scale from 1 to 10, with 10 being the most severe failure. And if you consider the FMEA origins in military, spaceflight, and automotive, these values are treated very, very seriously. Second is occurrence. Occurrence is linked with the overview of the cause, and how often this particular failure might occur is scored between 1 and 10. If it occurs very infrequently, we would see a score of 1. If it occurs many times and is often found, then it would be 10. We also have detection, which is how well the failure, once it occurs, can be found. If the failure goes undetected, it receives a score of 10. If the failure is easily detected and alerted to both users and the system itself, then it would be scored with a lower value. And finally, we have the risk priority number, which is the product of the severity score times occurrence times the detection score, and ranges from a calculated value of 1 to 1,000. Well, what about the actions associated with FMEA? We score the risk priority number, and then we start to look at the actions that would help us reduce, help us avoid, or possibly even eliminate that risk of failure. Then we start to plan those actions. In planning the actions, we determine what types of things we will be doing to mitigate the risk. Maybe this will be change requests. Perhaps we will create tasks to involve other stakeholders and experts to be able to give us guidance. Then we take actions. These actions might be creating new requirements for the current or future product releases, making modifications to design specifications so that certain areas of risks are entirely eliminated, and then perhaps also building the type of test cases to verify that the risk has been mitigated in our future product. After we think about these actions, we're given the opportunity to score a new risk priority number. That means what is the overall weighted score of this risk after the actions are taken. So I have a new severity value and a new occurrence value and a new detection value. And our goal with FMEA is to make sure that the new risk priority number is significantly less than the existing risk priority number. Well, how does an FMEA analysis look like without Polarian? Well, without Polarian, it often looks like a spreadsheet. In fact, it often is a spreadsheet. And as I'm sure many of us know, a document like a spreadsheet is very difficult, almost impossible to trace, and is almost impossible to audit over time. We see the document, and we have access to revisions of the document, but we never completely know who made certain changes to the document and when the document came about and how it exists. So the problem is that these project silos exist within our product development. Requirements management often lives in its own silo where requirements are elicited. Development and release management happens in the development organization where there's often not enough communication back and forth. And testing and quality assurance happens in its own silo. So we're effectively adding a fourth major silo of risk management. And if we separate all of this information, it becomes very tedious, almost impossible to integrate the data together and to trace what we did as a result of a scored FMEA risk within requirements management, development and release, and quality assurance. Well, Polarian's challenge, and the thing that I'll be addressing today, is to eliminate these silos. We definitely want to take the FMEA risk and integrate it with all the other development artifacts that we're commonly using in our product development cycle, so that information is shared and not segregated. That is my goal to be able to discuss with you today. So how are we going to do this? We're going to be able to have Polarian answer the question, when was the risk first detected? Who did make the changes to the FMEA risk items? When were these changes made, and what were the changes? And then, of course, how does that FMEA analysis impact all other development artifacts and work items? So we'll start doing this also from the perspective of a project that's already building. So FMEA is going to be a special work item called risk. It's going to have a special relationship between all the other development artifacts that I utilize, such as requirements and tasks and defects. We will be able to create a risk item in a standalone document. We'll be able to include risk analysis in our standard work breakdown structure. FMEA will have some specific custom fields that will be unique to this type of artifact. Fields such as cause, effect, controls, and actions. Detection and severity and occurrence in RPN become scoring for both before and after actions. And then finally, we'll have a special workflow that adapts directly to the process of FMEA risk analysis. Well, let's take a general overview of how we're going to establish the traceability of FMEA risk. So we want to be able to trace this risk to all the other project artifacts, which means if during testing I find an FMEA risk, that FMEA risk will be tied to that test case, and it can cause change to a change request. And the result of the Change Management Board reviewing that change request could be a new requirement. I also can develop a formal FMEA risk document which will contribute to perhaps new requirements before the product is ever launched. During software design, if I find a particular vulnerability associated with a web service or with a SQL Access database, then I'll be able to start an FMEA risk analysis to that particular item where perhaps it will cause additional tasks in development to make sure that vulnerabilities are closed, that different product is found, that the development seals that vulnerability before it occurs. We want to be able to integrate FMEA wherever it is needed. Of course, we'll always have the FMEA history to fall back to, who found it, and what was done about it. And very specially with Polarian, we will see that we'll be able to monitor and demonstrate the evolution of the entire risk analysis process so that at any point we'll be able to look back into the history, not just of requirements and development artifacts, but of FMEA itself. So our first development scenario, which I'll be focusing on now, is to take you to an e-library evaluation product in Polarian. And I'll show you the risk space. And we'll start looking at how we can format and view a risk specification document. We'll review some of these custom fields and look at the how-to knowledge base that's built into Polarian. So I'm going to leave my Polarian or my PowerPoint slide aside for a moment and open up the Polarian browser. Now, Polarian is entirely a Web 2.0 application. On the left-hand side, I have a navigation bar which sets the context for what I will be doing throughout my use of Polarian. In the right-hand side is the workspace, and for me right now, I've opened up the eLibrary demonstration project. It's a sample project which implements a very small library web service to check out books, look up and reserve books, and possibly also to check out electronic book content. Now, in this area here, you can see that I have quick links to being able to build requirement specification, taking those requirements and planning releases, using releases to organize the development work, and then ultimately to be able to test and verify. It's here in the middle that we'll be spending most of our time today. So I won't spend too much time talking about the other parts of the Polarian process, focusing mostly on how risk management can interact with those other development artifacts. So I'll click on that link, and this link opens up not a specification area, but a place where I can further define FMEA risk management in my project. You can see that I can combine informational text here to help train and remind my user population of how I'd like to organize risk management in this project. I have access to risk specification documents which can be created, and we'll look at in just a moment, as well as a quick scorecard on the progress or fulfillment of risk items. On the right-hand side here, you'll see a workflow which identifies the different states or life cycle of FMEA risk analysis. We begin in draft mode when that risk analysis is first created, and then we start the analysis where we perform the scoring. Then, during analysis, we plan our actions. These actions are now pending until they're taken, and I can move the analysis through to actions taken and ultimately through to completion. So from this particular page, I can launch and look at an existing risk specification document in this eLibrary project. And so if for those of you unfamiliar with the Polarian document view, the Polarian document view helps me organize these risk items in a very easy-to-read format, which will be very helpful for those used to editing in Microsoft Word. And here you can see that I have simply 3 risk items built into this particular risk specification document. I could create a new risk just by pressing the Enter key and typing. So what happens if my library card is stolen? that might be an initial risk that I want to start the process on. Now, this isn't a very serious risk, obviously, and we won't go into too much detail about it, but when I click Save up in the upper left, I'm able to now save this as a permanent artifact of my project, and you can see on the right-hand side that both the status and the RPN number, or the risk priority number of each item, is displayed. And so this brand new item has not yet been scored and hasn't been processed. So we see that it's essentially in that draft mode. And we'll get back to that idea later on. But what I wanted you to see is how easy it is to be able to work within this document view to be able to create some of these high-level ideas that might come out of meetings, that might come out of planning sessions. Well, I'm going to pause for just a moment and see if there's any questions. So I'm going to check in with the Q&A board. Now, I don't see any questions on the Q&A board, so I would encourage you to go ahead and write in questions to the Q&A module so that I can address them. I'll take a look at the chat here, and it looks like we're okay. All right. Well, one question that often comes up is what type of application do I have to install in order to use the Polarian client? And the answer is because the Polarian client is a web application, I can use virtually any operating system and any browser. So I'm running the Polarian user interface on Firefox on a Macintosh computer, but I would have exactly the same effects and operations if I was using IE on Windows or Google Chrome, and even using mobile devices like tablets and phones. Well, it's important to go back then and view the rest of this home page. And since I just created a new risk item, we can see that in my status, I have a new item formed under draft. So I have one item in draft, 3 items in analysis, and 1 in actions pending. Now, I have a couple of different ways of viewing this information. We just saw the information in a risk specification document, but we can also take a look at it in a worksheet view. And so this will open up the same risk information, but in a view very much like that spreadsheet that we originally saw. And I can view the IDs of each individual risk item, the original title, the status, and of course, the description and severity rating, the cause and occurrence rating, the controls and the detection rating, and ultimately the initial risk priority number. This is an indication that none of these items have been moved forward into actions taken. In fact, they're in a place where actions are pending and being planned. And this is something that I'll get to in just a moment. Now, from here as well, I can move directly to a table view. So instead of only viewing this in a document view, I can organize this in a very much Excel-like table view where I have access to each individual risk item as well as the full complement of attributes that can be set in Polarian to be able to accommodate not just the general categories of FMEA risk, but how you specifically choose to implement FMEA risk analysis. And that can include things like attachments and external hyperlinks where source information and research is formed. And you can provide that as supporting data and justification to the scoring methods associated with the risk. And later on, we'll see that from this view, we'll be able to export directly to a formal FMEA worksheet so that if I do have stakeholders who continuously want to edit and modify the risk document in a format they're used to, they can continue to use Excel as a means to add to and modify our risk items in Polarian. Well, I'm going to return back to my PowerPoint slide for just a moment. And here, as we move from our first scenario to our second scenario, now we're going to get a little bit more hard-hitting in the type of risks we could look at. So consider what an automotive risk might be. We're driving at high speeds on the Autobahn, and the electrical power in the car fails. Well, this I can imagine is a FMEA risk that has already been considered by many car manufacturers. Additionally, what happens if I am driving and my brake hydraulics fail? Well, obviously, each of these can have very serious ramifications to David Merrill, the driver. Well, let's take a look at a couple of others. What happens in both computer risk and business risk if I happen to own a new iPad and that iPad overheats? Or it just simply becomes too hot to handle without gloves? What would be the risk associated to the product and user, and what would be the business risk or the risk associated to brand name? Now, some of you might know that the new iPad has gone under some scrutiny for how hot it becomes when it's plugged into power and when it's running highly available applications like games. So I know some of you probably are iPad enthusiasts. I'm one of them. I own this same new iPad, so this risk is very interesting for me. And that's going to build our second scenario. And there's a last piece here, which is an interesting risk consideration for me, because what happens if during a webinar on FMEA risk, I lose my internet connection? That's certainly something that I've considered, and I have some mitigating actions behind those. But let's go back to Polarian now. So I'm going to bring my Polarian interface back, and I'm going to leave eLibrary for a moment and open up a different project. This project is my iPad project. And instead of viewing a document view associated to risk, I'm looking at a very brief summary of what could possibly be considered a system requirements document for an iPad. And as I move down through this requirement, I might find that here, under battery and power, as I analyze this particular requirement, I could say, all right, given these particular power requirements, what will happen? What will happen if the battery gets too hot? If the cord heats up and melts? What could the effects be? And so I could take action directly from here. I could make changes to this and comments to this particular requirement, or in my case, I'm going to move over to the table view where I can now view this requirement by itself, and I'm going to create an FMEA risk analysis associated to this. So I will click on this additions icon in the lower part of the window and create a new work item which assesses the FMEA risk of this requirement. And so once created, I can move through it and work on things like what the general failure and severity rating is. Well, one particular consideration here would be power cable melts on fabric and causes fire. That's a description of what that effect might be. What is the severity of fire? Well, I would consider fire to be very severe. Now let's move on to the cause. What is the potential cause? Too much power draw. What is the occurrence? Well, as an iPad user, this is an infrequent occurrence, so I'm going to give it an occurrence rating of 1. Now we move to controls and their detection. How do I detect the temperature of the cord? Well, I really can't, so I might say no controls in place. There's no thermostat on an iPad that I've seen, unless that app hasn't been created yet. What is the detection rating then? The detection rating is very high because I can't detect it until it happens or I touch it. So with these values now, I can create and save my new risk item. And if I move up to the top, we'll be able to see that as I move through the particulars of the project, the risk priority number is automatically scored based on what values I put in for severity, occurrence, and detection. And this risk has been permanently linked in a traceable way to the original requirement that caused this analysis. And from here, I can continue to refine this particular risk to say it's time to start my analysis. Well, I've really already done that, so we'll move quickly through here. The next option is Now it's time to plan actions. So let's move this into the plan actions phase, and I'll click Save. Look what happened. Because the workflow of Polarian dictated that I fill certain fields in at the various stages, I have to insert and add recommended actions. Well, let me move down through the screen to the field where it says recommended actions. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say add change requests and modify requirements. We need a temperature app. So I'm not going to just end it there, but rather I'm going to come back up to this area here. I'm going to save that field. So now I'm planning my actions. Now I'm ready to move in and create and work with the other artifacts that will add to the collaboration within my organization. So let me pause for a moment. I'm going to check back in with questions and chats. Griffin asks, are all the changes logged? Yes. In fact, if you remember, I mentioned at the very beginning that we always will know in Polarian what has happened, when it happened, who made the change, and what the change was. So let's take a look at this particular risk item here. Instead of viewing the current version, which I see right here, I can click on the History button at the top right. And now I'll be able to see all the changes that were made over time, both the old values and the new values, who the author of that change was, the date and time. In fact, I can always take a look at the original value. So if I click on this revision number, I will be able to see the state of this requirement at this particular point in time. And in fact, if you remember, we also had a risk document. So let's go back and take a look at the iPad risk specification document. And not only can I look at the history of just one particular artifact, but I can look at the history and evolution of the entire document. And I'll always be able to highlight a couple of revisions and compare what happened between the earlier revision of the document and the current revision of the document. And very much like track changes, I'll be able to, in Word, I'll be able to move through the document and see what was added and what was deleted. I can also visualize this on the work item level to see what, in this case, 2 new work items were created with new title and description between those two revisions. And I can return back now to the current revision of the document. This document can be exported for change and imported back in using the Word round trip feature. We'll see that a little bit later on with the Excel round trip using our FMEA document. Okay, so that was an excellent question. I appreciate you bringing that up. Whenever I look at the history or a historical version, I'll have an icon change here to the left of the work item ID that shows that it's a point in time, and I'll always be able to see the created and updated dates and the revision numbers here in the top right. If I want to show the current version, I just click Show Current, and that brings me to the latest and greatest revision of this risk, and again, how it impacts all of my other artifacts. For example, let's say when I plan my actions, I have a task to assign to somebody to help mitigate this risk. So I'm going to click on this task and say we want to research wire insulation and thicknesses. Now, even though I'm dealing in something that's hardware related right now, this is the same kind of task that could be launched to do research operations associated with finding better third-party applications to improve performance, or sealing vulnerabilities by upgrading to different versions of web services or database services. And if I attach a particular estimate to this amount of time, now I have a task which has been created and linked to my risk item, which will help in the mitigation of that risk. And of course, I'm going to be able to watch the life cycle of that task just like we're watching what happens to the risk item. Well, a couple of other things might happen. I might step in and say I'd like to have a change request, or I'm going to create a new requirement, and this new requirement is the new iPad shall have a default thermostat application. And this is going to be a functional requirement. I'm going to raise the level of severity to must-have. I can determine what releases it will be part of and make the definite assignments to alert the user to rising temperatures and possible shutdown. We need a new app. Now, I won't go into any more detail about what happens after that requirement, but of course that requirement can become part of the release planning, be assigned to development, and have its own set of tasks associated to the fulfillment of that requirement. Now let's deal with one other possible adaptation to this risk item. So that other one might be a test case. And the test case might be to be able to verify that power and heat test. And this test case may say, run iPad app for 6 hours, place under pillows and blankets, and check temperature. And the result that I would expect is that the temperature should be less than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so now I'm making sure that a test case will be created that will be executed to verify that we've successfully mitigated this particular risk. And obviously that test case does not modify the requirement for a new application, but I would certainly be able to attach new values to that particular requirement later on for testing and validation. Well, this gives me a very compartmentalized view of the relationship between requirements and risk items. I can also go back to my general view of Polarian, and instead of just viewing only risks, I can open up and view all work items. So now I can look at all the work items of my overall project. Or I can hone in and say, for example, I would only like to see the risk items. And now I see the risk items that we've just created, and I can expand this to show a tree view and the relationship of the risk items and what has happened during the analysis and planning and ultimately the actions taken to fulfill the mitigation of the risk items. So here I have an example of a new requirement and test case and change request being created to also address the same issue of overheating. And also we have some change requests to create a heat dissipating case. So whatever the actions should be taken, rather than just being a line in a spreadsheet, become a work item in Polarian that can be assigned and monitored and fulfilled as part of your regular product development. And that brings the living actions of FMEA analysis directly into your regular product development cycle. But for those instances where we really do need to get this information out in spreadsheet form, either for review of external stakeholders or possibly also for outside consultants to participate and contribute to, we will use a capability to export this into Excel. So using this gearbox up at the top, I'll pull down my possible options and I'll select Export. And in exporting this particular sheet, I'll choose Microsoft Excel. There are other formats which I can certainly export this data into, but as we discussed, this is a very typical format to move into Microsoft Excel. And I will select a specific FMEA risk worksheet as a format for export. And you can see here on the right-hand side that I have any number of columns that can be utilized and exported, either locked and read-only or accessible for edit by my stakeholder. I'm going to go ahead and click OK here, and this is going to produce a spreadsheet that either I can email to a stakeholder, or in my case, let me go ahead and save this to my desktop. Using my regular browser, I'll be able to open up my program in Excel and open that file. We'll take a look at what it is. So now in the spreadsheet format, I have the same IDs that I'm used to seeing in Polarian, which identify that item. I have the failure mode and the effects, the severity and occurrence, detection, and risk priorities. I also can, at this point, add to the new values. So based on the actions that I think we've taken in Polarian, I could hand this to a consultant who would say, with those changes, the severity here still stays high. If there is a fire, it's still a very severe issue. But now, both the new occurrence is low, and with the new thermostat application, with the new power cable, I have a much lower incident or problem of passing on without detection, so I have a low detection score. So I can add this information in and insert a comment, and I'm ready for the complement of the round-trip experience. So I'll put Excel down, and this exported the information so that my stakeholders could make changes. And now I'm ready to import those changes back in. So I will pick the gear wheel and import, and I'll import the Microsoft Excel round-trip changes. I'll look for and find the file that I made changes to and open that up and begin the import process. If there were any conflicts, then I would have been alerted to those conflicts. If I had also created new risk items, I would be able to see those as well. And I can view all items or just view the one work item that was changed. So I'll click on just view that one work item which is changed. And now I have a scope limited to just those values. And I move through my scoring and can see then that I have the new severity, new occurrence, and detection rating of that particular outside change. Coming back now, I'll be able to, at any point, also review the general risk categories and their further status. So here I've moved some items through to analysis. Now, ours was still in actions pending, if you remember, and now we think we've completed it to make action, that the action should be completed, and the rest of the process will continue. So I will change the state of this risk item from actions pending to taking actions and save that. I filled in the recommended actions, but I didn't come in and fill in the mandatory field called work items created, refer to traceability. And now I'll be able to save that information. Okay, well, that concludes the majority of the topics that I have to show you in Polarian. I'm going to return back to my PowerPoint for a moment and summarize that we've seen risk items be created with respect to other requirements. We've seen these risk items also be associated to mitigating tasks and verifying test cases, so that the FMEA risk category, which once existed as a spreadsheet, now is part of our integrated artifacts and development work items of the rest of the project. I'd like to encourage you to take some next steps with Polarian by either downloading the free trial or trying it live. You can access at Polarian.com a live trial which will get you access to the eLibrary project and to the FMEA risk section of that project. You can also interact directly with our teams to be able to request an on-site proof of concept, as well as view other demonstrations and other webinars. I would also like to invite your comments to me. I'm very interested to understand what your current challenges are with respect to requirements management as they apply to risk, whether it's FMEA-based risk or other risk management methodologies. If you do have problems of FMEA analysis and need a solution now, I'd very much like to hear that and see if we can continue a more focused dialogue into some of the challenges that you face. And of course, I'm very interested and happy to see and hear from your comments and feedback.